Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Emerging Pod, where we guide emerging people into emerging career. Today's guest is Guillaume Bouchard. Guillaume started his career in research with a PhD in applied mathematics, and then spent the next 15 years as a research scientist studying a variety of topics in data science and machine learning, including natural language processing, sentiment analysis, and Bayesian inference, with application in digital image categorization and financial fraud detection. He co-founded Bloomsbury AI in 2015, sold it to Facebook in 2018 to combat the fake news. Now he's co-founder and CEO of CheckStep, an AI platform helping companies understand and moderate user-generated content. Guillaume, great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sofiane.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Guillaume. From that intro, is there anything important that we missed?
No, it's a very good summary. Thank you.
Nice, we'll take it. So the title of your PhD is Generative Models in Supervised Statistical Learning with Applications in Digital Image Categorization and Structural Reliability. Very easy to pronounce. Now, transformer models weren't really around at the time, but is this something like a ChatGPT ancestor?
Yes. Generative models have been there for a long time, and I'm glad that you pointed it out because indeed, I was lucky enough to start my career in academia. I really wanted to do machine learning, but under the statistical side of it. To understand it, you had to really understand the two types of big models. One was called generative models, and one was called discriminative model. Everybody was doing discriminative model because generative model were very poor, really poor. Basically, it's like fitting a Gaussian distribution that a lot of people know from high school, maybe grades. And yes, so the reason I started with this topic is because of Andrew Ng, the Stanford professor who created this Coursera, founder of Coursera, but also the most seen course on machine learning. So he became a celebrity based on that. But Andrew Ng, during his PhD at Berkeley, wrote a paper really illustrating theoretically how these two types of approach for machine learning played could be combined. And I thought, oh, it's beautiful. And that I spent my whole PhD, so 3 years, to really understand how to combine them in practice.
And from that time, did you foresee how generative models would kind of explode in popularity in the next 15 to 20 years? Or did you think it was going to take longer?
To be honest, my conclusion at the end of my PhD is that, forget about generative model. Let's just do discriminative. We can discuss it extensively, but in short, a generative model were seen as good when they had some structure. It was like when you really had data with a well understood structure, such as sequences or image like grids, where you could say, but every time the discriminative model with more data becomes better. And it's still true today. But what was not perceived is the power of transferring the knowledge from one task to another. So it's called multitask learning. So if you merge generative model with multitask, then you get something completely magical happening. And this was discovered with these large language models. But it came after 15 years, where it was back and forth between generative and discriminative. We did not really find a usefulness in generative model outside machine translation. And this is really where the big discovery was made.
That's very interesting.
And it's linked to my career. You will see that after 11 years of research, a guy I knew, Ilya Sutskever, the co-founder and chief scientist of OpenAI, wrote a paper. And I don't think he speaks French, Ilya Sutskever. I'm not sure. But what I know is that he wrote the best, or one of the best, English to French translation engine. Just by using 300,000 translation of sentences from the EU government. They have very well-aligned translation. So a guy from a French university of Le Mans, which is not very tiny university, he did this data set of 300,000 sentences. That was used by this Google engineer, Elias Suskever, who basically wrote this paper called Sequence-to-Sequence Learning, where he showed that machine translation could be solved using a generative model, this large language model, and that was a discovery for me. I came to see all the linguists in my research research team, but they say, "Oh, it's nothing." Yeah, it's just yet another paper. But I just realized people were not seeing that actually you could now learn how to generate text, and that was completely new. And when I see that, I couldn't stop but thinking everything will be incremental now in machine learning. I just quit my job, quit my country. I had three kids. I did not quit them, but I went to London. They stayed in France. I did too much. And went to UCL with a top researcher, Sébastien Rideau, just to focus on, doing an impactful project, a startup in AI. But it was really inspired by this ancestor to ChatGPT called the sequence-to-sequence learning.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting how that inspired you to make such a big life choice in kind of like the snap of a finger.
Well, that was a combination of factors, but this was the main one. I had three big factors. I wanted always to be abroad, so London is not a bad place, not too far from my kids, and I wanted my kids to learn English. So there was a combination of three factors, but I would say that was really the one that pushed the balance really toward moving to London.
That's interesting. You mentioned you at the time when you were doing research, you would publish about 5 to 6 papers per year. How do you maintain this kind of output?
Well, they are not always super innovative. Often they are improvements of what we did before. But my superpower, I would say, is collaborative work. I love interacting with others, exchanging ideas, and to go, like going into a football game or a rugby game together as a team. And I really like this. So I have very few papers by my own, even if I spent a lot of time as an academic, reading, working on ideas, but it's collaborative work basically. It's not a big team. It's often 2, 3, 4 people who work together. But I loved academia. You meet the smartest people on earth. All across the world, you travel across the world. So it was great for 10 years, 15 years. So that was my motivation. I was a geek. I really wanted to speak to my computer. I just wanted to, and I thought machine learning was the way to speak to your computer.
That's interesting. And so after that, you started Bloomsbury AI. How did the idea come about?
Bloomsbury AI actually was created before I even left. So I had 6 months where I was transitioning jobs. So we created Bloomsbury AI with 6 people. So me and Sébastien, my co-founder, and 4 postdoc and PhD students from UCL, from his team. So it was quite unbalanced, but I had no idea, it's like a group of 6 people creating the next DeepMind. That came just after in the Sébastien group at UCL in London. There was a company called Deep Blue Lab that was acquired by DeepMind for an undisclosed amount, but they made a good exit. 4 people only, 4 researchers with just a demo of AI on a mobile app. And so my co-founder said, let's do the same. That was a thing in academia. Like you create a company and you have a quick exit. But it was not exactly what I wanted. I really wanted to make something useful. So I went to see a venture capitalist, and I learned in London 50% of my time I worked at UCL as a researcher. We had one of the most cited paper, as I mentioned. during this time, developing the ability to use complex numbers in machine learning. But what really drove me was to create this company, Bloomsbury AI, where we wanted to use the skills of the team, which was understanding knowledge bases and answering question answering. So you can read a text and answer question, but it could be quite complex questions. Such as what the population of this country. So it's relatively easy, but you had more complex questions. Say if you were reading a legal document, am I allowed to do this? Or what is the maximal penalty for breaching this? For inviting, or can I invite my wife to a company dinner? And you had to read the compliance document of your company. That's the type of application we are doing at Bloomsbury AI. It was fun. It was great. We started to have a product, but it was still early days.
Nice.
What would happen if if the AI would give you a wrong answer?
Aha.
And it was like an important kind of
the same
issue.
Same with generative AI today. Same with ChatGPT. You have to be careful about the answer. So it will always give you a reference to a span of text, a reference to the place where it found information. That's the way we designed our AI. So the person who has the answer has a reference and can check that indeed it was properly interpreted. But it's a very good question. Sometimes it will answer the wrong question because it was a paragraph that only applied to managers and not to employees, or only to employees and not to managers. So understanding the context was and is still a tricky part of machine learning, because you need to read the entirety of the document to understand.
Interesting. I like the part where you're saying how you like to work in teams of 4 or 5 researchers, even when you were producing a lot of papers. Do you feel like your mindset has had to shift much when you moved from research to the entrepreneurial space?
No, this is the opposite. It's because it's too small. When you're in academia, you work on one paper, so you have a small team, like a small startup, but you have 3 months or 6 months, and then you publish, and then you go to the next project. You're actually not building really impact. You're building papers that then are read by your peers at a later stage. But it's very hard. The code, often the source code, you might publish it, but it's not built on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
Few researchers, such as the one who created PyTorch, became PyTorch and was followed. So open source projects, but it's quite rare. There is a lot of code out there that is never used. So with this small team in research, you can't really have massive impact. So I said, instead of spending my time convincing others to do bigger projects, because that's really what I wanted, let's just ask money for people and pay people to do what I think would be a big impact. And so I thought the VC world or the startup world would be much, much better to have bigger team, bigger impact. I was frustrated by the limitation of academia, because academia is very smart, but it's very hard to say, oh, let's do what DeepMind did, for example, solving a complex academic problem that was how to play the game of Pong, how to win the game of Pong, or reinforcement learning, basically, was not solved by an academic team. It was solved by a startup. People just asking VC money and having a team of 20 people on building something with a single objective. So I was really inspired by these type of stories.
That's interesting. And how did you approach then recruiting people? So before you're in academia, you know how to spot talent between academics. How did you approach it now that you had to go maybe open up your pool of candidates?
Yeah, so I had a good network. So academia, when you're at UCL, so we co-founded, we were a UCL spin-off. And so we had access to a pool of students relatively easily, especially because my co-founder, Sebastian, became professor at UCL of computer science. And there was a lot of very smart students who wanted to come. The issue of students is that They think, oh, startup is cool and so on, but they don't necessarily have experience. They want to start their own startup. So it goes into many directions. So actually, it did not really solve the problem. You still need to maintain on very hard to make sure that people don't go left and right on follow a direction. I was probably not ambitious enough. I probably did not believe enough in what we were doing, because now that we see ChatGPT, how stupid we were just to stop this question answering business. But that's what happened. Recruiting was linked to my network, on the network of my co-founder. We very rarely used a recruiting agency. Only once. A great person, but not with an academic profile that Facebook or Google would pay for an acquisition. They were really looking at top PhDs with a lot of publications.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, since we're using your network, how did you gauge candidates? What did good look like back then for you?
Oh, look. For me, it was how smart they were initially, which is super naive, because then I realized, no, they need to be something else. And I spoke to a lot of people. What is your main criterion? And I realized one that I really like. It's Daniel Hulme, who told me, I look for curious people, because if you're curious, you will probably have a lot of skills that make you successful in life. So I now use this, but the thing what I learned is that it's very hard. You make so many mistakes to recruit people, either in my domain or outside my domain. For many reasons, I just constantly make mistakes. I don't have a secret recipe. So now, while I'm a statistician, I have a PhD in statistics, I believe in data. At the end of the day, I use my intuition and experience. Maybe it's a combination of data, which is hard to explain. I'm sorry to answer this, but I definitely don't have a secret recipe. What's worked for me at CheckStep, we have amazing teams, hard to do better. It's pure network. I'm asking, okay, who is the best person you ever worked with? And then I go to this person, I say, hey, we have an amazing project. Do you want to join? That's how we recruited our VP of engineering, who is doing the work of 3 engineers, is managing the full team. It's incredible. Just because I asked an old friend who was the best CTO I ever worked with. So that's a good example here. So I'm trying to use peer validation because they worked with someone.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. There's no better substitute to actually working with someone. And since you can't work with everyone, you might as well, piggyback off the people that that have a good judgment. And how was so you mentioned then you sold Bloomsbury AI. So selling a company for a lot of entrepreneurs, it's essentially the reward. It's the moment where you get rewarded for all of your work, at least financially. How was it for you?
Well, it was it was rewarding, but was mostly to get out of a path that went probably a little bit too uncertain. I did not have yet a product. If I wanted to have a product, I had to wait still a year to refine our question answering system, to really focus on legal compliance and insurance business that were outside my world. I did not have a commercial person, so we had a great team. So what we did is one day we said, okay, it's hard to continue to raise the next round, so let's find an acquisition, because we had potential interest already. It was called Plan B, and then Plan B became Plan A, and we spoke to the people we know at Facebook, Google, Twitter, on smaller startups such as Criteo in France. And but we got offers to all of them.
Nice.
From all of them.
Nice.
Even I learned later that Microsoft was behind it, but I never spoke to Microsoft. But the CEO of Microsoft was somehow informed. I learned it very a few years later. So we were a very hot startup, let's say. So we could leverage the competition between large companies. But I can't really disclose much information here. But it felt release, but at the same time, it's very different. You're no more a startup founder. You're a middle manager in a huge organization. So you became a corporate guy from one day to another. So it's good for 6 months, but then you realize that politics is what is the game, and it's not a game I necessarily want to play.
Was it the first time? Was it your first time working in corporate?
No, I worked for Xerox for 11 years after my PhD. So just to recap, I have an engineering degree. I did a PhD for 3 years in statistics on machine learning, like what you mentioned, generative AI. But then I worked 11 years for Xerox. But we were isolated. We were in a castle in the Alps.
Oh, wow.
I'm not joking. Like a beautiful park. Now it belongs to Naver Labs, which is a Korean company, but it was called Xerox Research Center Europe. It was just a beautiful place. And with very smart people, and we are only publishing, but to publish, we had to write patents. So I wrote 50 patents in 11 years. It's not so. One colleague did more, but it was, that was the rule of the game. No impact, just patents. We tried, but I tried to have impact by doing a lot of different projects. But corporation, it's so hard when you're isolated. So we were the academic side of Xerox, who has a culture of innovation, or had, I might say. For example, Palo Alto Research Center is well known for Xerox, but we were the center where we had the highest concentration of machine learning talent in between 2004 and 2015.
Was Xerox pretty much, do you feel like they were somewhat ahead of their time in terms of their investment in research?
They were in the 80s and 90s. There was a big change where they had to cut half of their research spend in year 2000. It was 4 years before I joined. So it was somehow a recovery. There was this culture of, I think they call it open innovation, like blue sky research. I'm not, we are quite isolated from the day-to-day business. They tried to make connections. I'm not sure. I think for me, Xerox felt like a granda company or grandma company, where they were more or less in the decline. They did not adapt to the new world. So yes, it was a great place, but it's very hard to have impact. It's also far in the Alps. You're isolated. It was pre-COVID, so remote work was not easy. So we had to have people to go there, even if the place was great. I think there is more concentration in London, in the Bay Area, maybe in New York, of great talent to really nurture and create a hub of
open
innovation, I would say.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, you felt like a bit like a bubble. So just going back then so you get into Facebook and you felt the parts of the big corporate that you didn't really like, and then you decided to found CheckStep. How did that one come about?
When I left Facebook, I really wanted to do my old dream, which is the ownership of data. So a privacy-based business where you could own your data and be rewarded for it. That was what I wanted to do. 10 years before I started working on this, and there was a technology called federated learning that I wanted to somehow use to support this new business around privacy. But I couldn't find a good business model around privacy because people can just sell all their data for £100. their whole life. All privacy is very hard to deal with. There is a new angle around the GDPR on the that I wanted to play, but COVID happened, and so on one of the company I was helping was doing a misinformation flagging. COVID happened. 1 month before, my first employee at Bloomsbury AI, who in between was became tech lead at JP Morgan, a bank, just told me, I'm bored at home, and I saw this guy in this misinformation startup. He wants some volunteer to help to limit the flow of misinformation. You know, the anti-Chinese sentiment, origin of the and say, oh yeah, but don't go to this startup. Go to the startup I just invested in. So we went together. We tried to help this person, and then we realized it was probably the wrong investments that I made in this startup. So after 3 weeks, we said, oh no, it won't go anywhere. And we said the opportunity is huge. So let's do it part-time. And we created a company just in case. And we were part-time for 6 months. And after 6 months, we realized, wow, it's the same as GDPR. There is a regulation coming. It's called the Online Safety Bill in the UK. And in Europe, they do the same, the Digital Services Act. Sorry. So there's 2 pieces of regulation, which is basically online harm regulation. So this is the end of internet as we know. You are liable for the content that is shared on your platform. So it's massive. When you see that, you just, okay, let's go full time. So from one day to another, when we realize that regulations are coming, we say this will be a sustainable business, and we decided to go full time. We raised, $500,000 from all my angel investors, came back, but one, Matt Bellamy, the founder of Muse, decided not to invest because he thought that it was not a good exit for the first
Name
time.
and shame.
Shots fired.
But still, out of 6, 5 angel investors came back and gave me $500,000 to start the company. So we went full time 6 months after the beginning of the lockdown. 9 months after the beginning, the first lockdown. So 2020. October 2020, where 2 of us started full time. We hired 3 employees and built a content moderation system. Because that was what I was doing at Facebook. But Facebook were firefighting every issues on internet one by one by creating a team dedicated to it, but was not really unified. So if you're a smaller platform with nothing, what do? You can't recreate what Facebook had done. They had 1,000 engineers on the problem. So what we did is that we created a unified platform that could handle any type of harm by enabling integration of a lot of different inputs and services.
What are some of the mistakes that you've learned from Bloomsbury AI that you're doing differently with CheckStep?
Oh, so many you can't imagine. So I can't list them all, but we mentioned recruiting. It's close to your heart. So that's probably, but I still made some big recruiting mistakes. At Bloomsbury AI, I made sure my legals were right, because at Bloomsbury AI, I didn't know anything about creating a business. I'm a PhD in statistics. I never studied business. I didn't know what was share or investors, or I had to learn everything at Bloomsbury AI. I made mistakes in my shared register, for example, and that shouldn't have happened. So when I created the CheckStep, for example, I used seed legals. Which did not exist, by the way, but seed legals just simplified me. When I create a startup, I can innovate in one direction. On everything else, I don't innovate. I just take things which are standard. Why creating non-standard employment agreement? I just use the template that is recommended. So no innovation, because you reduce uncertainty everywhere else, but in the place where you're innovating. There are few examples of mistakes that I made legals on hiring.
And then in terms of the first customers, what was your approach? Did you use your network, or did you start to deploy a more methodical sales process?
Same. Network. Who do you know? Until recently, we hired a person in LinkedIn, and it was not a good idea. But yeah, we went through the people we know. The head of product, she's amazing. She quit Mineta to join us. She loves the story. She wanted to have something new. Then it was connections through our co-founder from academia, who came the first machine learning angle. But then we realized machine learning play is not what is needed. It's more something which is orchestration. So hiring a software engineer was key, and it was one of them was through IT consulting company. So one of the IT consultants became a permanent employee because he was exceptional. We had to pay the poaching. There is a clause that prevents you from hiring people in the IT. So there is still some negotiation to have.
So now we live in the age of generative AI. Where are we now with this? We were talking with one of our previous guests, Andy McMahon, head of MLOps at NatWest, about the advantages that scale has provided so far. Is scale all you need? You've mentioned that as well.
Yeah, there's a big debate of people who are a little bit nostalgic. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think scale and the amount of data access is key. Internet-enabled data access. So without internet, but a lot of computational power would be useless. In this case, we have both availability, a huge amount of data available, and the Moore's law, even if this morning my son told me, the Moore's law, we are really at the atomic level, so we can't really increase the number of transistors. So it's the end of the Moore's law. Well, it's not that simple. It's still, computational power is still increasing by parallelization, for example. So I think, we have, you probably are aware about all these exponential curves, and the human mind cannot really imagine the exponential growth. It's very hard for us to extrapolate, and that's what happened with computational power. This incredible growth of power was translated here into a tool, let's say large language models, that is extremely powerful and will completely change the society as we know.
If you had these AI tools back when you were in academia, what more could you have achieved, do you think, in terms of output or maybe impact?
As of today, or if I stayed in academia?
If you had them back then, when you were publishing 5 to 6 papers a year, do you think your output would have increased, or do you think maybe the level of impact of your findings would have improved?
Yeah, it's hard to know, because I think I would have more. I got the recipe to get highly cited paper. There is still a recipe that you learn through the years. There is also your network people. You tend to read the paper of your peers, so you need to be sufficiently friendly. It's not always that, but it's still a community. I think that it's still quite incremental. So even if I would have a name, look, outside machine learning, nobody knows. Who invented the transformer? Do you know? Even the person that I mentioned, Ilya Sutskever, he's the guy probably behind what happened at OpenAI, but people only remember Sam Altman, who is the business guy and the visionary person. So it's somehow accepting to be in the shadows. There is not even the Nobel Prizes. Who knows the name of the Nobel Prizes? There is no Nobel Prize in computer science. There is a Turing Award, which is quite incredible. Yann Lequin at Facebook received it. But I don't think I would have received the Turing Award, though. I was probably not strong enough to do that.
That's fair. There's a research scientist and entrepreneur. His name is Gary Marcus. You might know of him. He recently wrote an article in The Atlantic, which is called "The Age of Infinite Misinformation Has Arrived."
Yes.
He made a point that generative tools for text, images, video, sound have captured the public's imagination, and bad actors are taking note. Companies are rushing to launch products very quickly without really vetting the things that they launch, which leads to misinformation at an enormous scale. And this threatens the fabric of democracy. Do you think the future is doom and gloom, or is it a bit more balanced? You're kind of working against that, I suppose. So I think it's a topic close to your heart.
So I want to be humble enough and not to make prediction about the future, but what I can just say is that variance will increase in the sense that it will be more and more uncertain. We don't know what will happen. However, for misinformation, it's still the case. You don't need generative AI or fake information to create deceiving content. What is dangerous is that you can do it at scale. But it's mostly about education. Actually, misinformation improves it as it forces you to be more educated because you just don't want to be exploited. If misinformation increases, then schools, kids become more resilient to misinformation. So it's a little bit like viruses. If everybody gets a virus, you get natural immunity. So I think there is mostly old people like me and even older who tend to see how the new generation will be is doomed. I don't think so. I have my kids say, of course, sometimes it's clear a scam, but you discover it. If you give them the tool to be protected when they are young, and that's what's my day-to-day business with CheckStep, I'm not so scared about that because people are not stupid. That's it doesn't mean we shouldn't protect. We should protect the person who are at threats, especially at threat. But we still have our free will. We still understand who wants to manipulate us. It might not be the case if you have independent AI, but as soon as the humans are behind it, then you need to understand the intent. Why am I receiving this email? Why? Or is it's too good to be true? All these type of tricks. We were not equipped when we were young to do that, but now that we know it exists. We can educate, speak about it, give examples. What's important, though, is that we are not split. That's the danger for me in society. So, the fact that people in Russia, they don't have any or any information from the West world, or completely biased, and maybe us, we receive biased information about what's happening. China also have what the government wants them to see, and that for me is the biggest danger, is the fact that you break basically the communication between people who in the past were disagreeing, but today they don't even speak. They just hate each other without even interacting. And that's what scares me. It's more about breaking connections. So AI will be a tool that will make people more powerful, and yes, to deceive others in many other ways than misinformation. I think there is plagiarism. You might say it's misinformation, but not really. You're plagiating or just being deceiving content. It's not misinformation. It's just manipulating someone for your goals. And by the way, even misinformation by itself is quite tricky to define. I worked on it for so many years now. A joke is a misinformation most of the time. A lot of jokes are actually, it's all about teasing you. So you can't even really decide. the issue, I think a better definition on Preslav Nakov, our co-founder at CheckStep, who left since, but he had a very good definition. He said, what's important is intent. We should focus on the intent. If the intent is to deceive you, to exploit you, to take advantage on you, this is what you need to fight. And that's what we often mean by misinformation. It's not the fact that it's fake, because as I mentioned, sometimes it's just fake for just provoking someone, or fake for a joke. And we need to be able to maintain this level of communication. That's what I like, despite all the up and down of Twitter. That's what I like with Twitter. This is one of the rare places where you have really the opposite, who, even if they are fighting each other, they're insulting each other, they are speaking. And I'm afraid the day where they will be in their Mastodon server and without connections between them. That's what scares me.
That's a very good point. You mentioned biased earlier. Do you see? So one of the issues with bias in machine learning and artificial intelligence is just on the data that's collected and that's available when training those models. Do you see a place where generative AI can help generate data that can combat bias?
So first, there will always be bias. Because unbiased, what does it mean? You still need a reference about how you compute your mean, and unbiased means the mean is at zero. You never make a mistake. I think what's important with bias, it's extreme bias. It's normal to have bias, but when they go completely uncontrolled and there is a significant impact for underrepresented minority, that's very important. So that's why we need guardrails. But I think that we really need to focus on the extremes, because otherwise we'll always find bias. You can do whatever you do, you will find bias. Like, I'm French, from my accent already, you're biased. I can tell you, because I'm already biased, just by hearing someone with an accent. And how can you remove that? You can't remove your experience, the correlations that your mind created. So I think we need to accept bias. What we need is to measure it, so that it doesn't go extreme, that we don't have a significant impact on people. But I'm really not, despite being a content moderation company, I'm not aiming at bias zero. I'm aiming at controlled bias. If you see what I mean. I've been subject to biases, positive and negative, because I'm a white male, so I benefited from some bias. But also, in some situation that I can't disclose, unfortunately, I was badly treated just because of who I am.
I'm sorry to hear that, but yeah, I feel like we all experience bias in some.
Yeah, I wouldn't complain, because some people suffer even more. So it's important to realize that bias exists, and aiming for bias zero, it's the same as, it always reminds me the Aryan theory of saying, oh, let's make humanity better by selecting genes. Everybody thought, oh yeah, of course. And now it sounds like awful. And bias zero will have the same effect. If you want, because you might say, oh, let's kill everyone who is biased. Yeah, you will remove bias.
Yeah, and
So you can, sorry, it's a little bit philosophical, but it's, I think that sometimes we are going into this direction.
That's a very realistic take, I think, to have on bias. Is you can't remove it, you just have to measure it and make sure it doesn't go out of control.
It's respect is important, because if we try to overly measure, I can't remember the person who did it. Once you measure, then you start having people who are exploiting it. It's the same here.
Yeah, a lot of people think that bias is bad and it should be fully removed, which it's a fair perspective, but it's not really realistic. So I think going back to the definition of, okay, what is bias and where is it present, gives a bit more of a nuanced and realistic approach to how it can be eliminated when it actually inflicts harm on people.
Saying that you're unbiased is like saying that you're God, that you have the truth.
The truth.
No, but who owns the zero bias decision-making capability? Who owns it? Even you might say governments, but who would say governments are not biased? If it's true democracy, then it's probably the best idea that we have. But even a democracy is within a culture, it's cultural. I find it very hard.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I think it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about the role of platforms like Facebook, Twitter, etc. That are those are the platforms where content is distributed. But how should they be treated? Should they be treated as publishers and editors, or should they just be treated as a distribution mechanism? Which means that they don't really have their liabilities are limited, which then will impact to the extent to which they moderate and discriminate against types of content, let's say.
I think the current legislations that are coming, which is being liable for harm that are caused by the distribution, is enough. You don't need to speak about publisher or not. You already have the notion of publisher for the broadcasting, but here it's a new way of perceiving what is the social value of online platforms. They have a huge social value, like dating apps. It's probably the most impactful. It's a small business because nobody pays for that, or very few people pays for it. But it is changing the way genes are distributed in the population.
Very true.
Okay, because that's how most of people meet and marry today. And so the children today, their DNA depends on their parents, which have been, somehow biased by a dating algorithm. So the most powerful person on earth is probably the head of recommendation engine at Tinder. This guy, if you met him, if you interview him, he's the most powerful person on earth because he has a direct impact on the distribution of genes on the society.
Yeah.
That's definitely a soundbite.
I don't know if it answers.
We're approaching kind of the end of the show. I'd love to keep talking, but for the audience, do you have any advice for how they should think about breaking into data science? What should they focus on? What was the role of a portfolio? What's the role of networking? Anything that would help.
It's hard for me to give advice because I always felt as an outlier in life. I have never met someone who is really even close to the way I think. So I always felt an outlier everywhere I am. But maybe there are people who feel like that. And it's a curse, but it's also a blessing because you can basically build your own path, which is unique, and it's up and down. But I would say that in the difficult time, and this is probably what I would like to say, is that there are difficult times, and it's very important to have a network to keep old friends because they are the ones that our family. They are the one who can help in the most difficult time because I took decisions I shouldn't have made, but I don't have a regret because I had to take them. But changing, for example, leaving my job, my country, and leaving 3 kids in France for some times was definitely too much at the same time, for example. So I would recommend just to keep a strong network because that's what supports you when things becomes really too hard. And speaking about mental health is also something quite important.
Words of wisdom. Perfect. Guillaume, thank you so much for your time. This has been a very enlightening and interesting conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. And looking forward to meet you in person.
Yes, our pleasure. We're all in London, so definitely easy to grab a coffee. Perfect. Thanks again for your time, and see you soon.